Hey, everybody. My name's Kate Gordon. I'm the CEO of California Forward. We are a statewide think and do tank working to build a California economy that is resilient, sustainable, and inclusive across every region of this great state. And this is the inaugural California Dreamshot podcast, where we'll be digging deep on the issues and policies that shape California, how we can build an economy that benefits everyone, and having fun doing it at the same time. So we're going to be covering two main topics that we think of as really at the heart of the intersection of climate and the economy: the energy and industrial transition, which Priyanka and I will be talking about, and the actual impacts of climate change on our economic and financial systems, which Nuin-Tara and Carolyn will talk about. So we're going to have two shows, so much information, so many great guests. We'll be releasing these every other week, 2 a month. So our hope is the shows will reach and be useful to a bunch of people out there: legislators, those in the philanthropy space, philanthropists, philanthropops. I never know what to call them. Our California Forward partners, potential partners, UAW CMGE's partners, Insurance for Goods partners. This is a podcast for everyone out there who wants to help move California forward. So welcome to our first show. With our kickoff episode today, we want to give all of you out there in the audience an opportunity to meet the host, get a sense of format, and what to expect with this California Dreamshot podcast. So I'm going to go around the room, or the many rooms that we're in, and do some brief intros. And just briefly, I'm Kate Gordon. I've been working for a bunch of years in small nonprofits, big think tanks, with the Newsom administration, with the Biden administration. So I'm excited to be surrounded by super smart people, including my good friend and partner in crime, Nuin-Tara Key. Over to you.
Hello, I'm Nuin-Tara Key, COO here at California Forward. I've spent the last couple decades working on climate policy, coming up through local and regional government, and then I had the privilege of serving in state government here in California, working for 2 governors. I've also, hopped back and forth between domestic and international work, but I've really spent the last decade working on climate risk and resilience, including a stint working in insurance. So basically where climate risk meets public budgets. And that's exactly the space where we'll be in every month on our podcast.
So I think we're going to jump to Carolyn after we jump to Priyanka. So first you, Priyanka, in the theme of people who worked together in the Newsom administration who are on this podcast.
Yes. So excited to be on this podcast with you all. Hey, everyone. My name is Priyanka Mohanty. I'm the executive director of an organization called the United Auto Workers Center for Manufacturing a Green Economy, or CMGE for short, because we have an extremely long name. I come to this work from sort of a decade in climate world. As mentioned, I worked for both Kate and Nuin-Tara at the Office of Planning and Research, but I started my career internationally working with country governments in Asia on what we called climate economic policy. I also spent some time at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab as a scientist studying batteries, which I'm very excited about, and I think that they are going to change the world. And CMGE, which I lead now, is a nonprofit climate and workforce organization that's connected to the United Auto Workers Union. And I'm really excited to talk to you all about all of these things and many more, including the big topic of industrial policy, good jobs, our energy transition, how do we make it successful here in California? So excited for all of it.
Awesome. And of course, none of those great things can get built if they can't be insured. So super excited that Carolyn Kousky is here with us as well. Carolyn.
Great. Thanks. Yeah, it is a pleasure to be with all of you for this podcast series. So I'm Carolyn. I'm the founder and executive director of Insurance for Good. While I've been thinking about disaster insurance and recovery and resilience for 2 decades now, Insurance for Good's a young nonprofit. We're coming up on 2 years this summer. We work with communities and the public sector to support insurance-related solutions that can support their broader social and environmental goals, usually around, again, issues of recovery and climate resilience. While we're a nationwide nonprofit, we do a lot of work in California, so I'm delighted to be talking about issues in the state. We work with California communities on innovative solutions and state agencies on insurance-related programs and planning, and support decision makers with unbiased and expert policy analysis. So I'm very excited to chat with Nuin-Tara each month about the fiscal and economic impacts of climate change and how we can better manage those risks.
Awesome. It's all the big issues: finances, insurance, industrial policy, growth, equity. We're going to talk about it all. So let's kick it off with a little discussion about what is in the news this week. Priyanka, I think you brought something for us to focus on.
Yeah, so less about in the news. I think we'll get to that. Mostly, I just wanted to talk about, I was just in Mexico and I saw a ton of BYDs of all stripes and colors. I really think it's important we talk about the color palette here, some gorgeous pastels that really made me think about those old school Fords, if you guys remember those, like from the 70s. And
Those
80s.
like baby blue Ford giant cars. I don't know how anyone parallel parked those cars. I always think that when I watch those movies, I'm like,
Well, to me, you know what stuck out to me about those cars? They were such beautiful colors, and I kind of love the bench seating, like in the front and the back.
totally. Pre-seatbelt.
Pre-seatbelt, like people were smoking cigarettes outside of the window, you know. But in all seriousness, every driver I talked to in Mexico highlighted how affordable these cars were, how easy the charging was. I'm really curious how the U.S. will engage with the entrance of BYDs into the North American market. You know, will we see an emergence of a U.S. BYD or our version of BYD? So that's one thought for you guys. And then the other thought is not really a thought at all, other than I am so excited for the World Cup. I have been watching 4 to 5 games a day. It's really so beautiful to see countries coming together. If you guys haven't seen the videos, I recommend small town Kansas welcoming the Algerians, the Scottish drinking Boston Dry, and also Dutch people learning about Waffle House in the South. It's incredible.
Drinking Boston Dry is not easy to do. So the Scots are the ones to do it. But I love what you said also, Priyanka, about the BYD question. BYD is for those not as obsessed as all of us is, or at least me and Priyanka, is the Chinese electric vehicle that's kind of taking the world by storm in terms of affordable EVs. And really, really interesting question for California in particular as an EV leader. Like, what are we going to do about bringing affordable EVs? Something that I learned a couple years ago that I always have found fascinating is that only 6% of Californians buy about 35 to 40% of all new cars. So the new car thing is important, but actually, we got to get more affordable new cars so more people can buy new cars, which basically people can't right now. A third of Californians live paycheck to paycheck. You're not out there buying a new car. But also, like, let's get more cars into the system, period. So more on the used market and have some thought about incentives for that, not just kind of goals and incentive for new cars, because that's actually a pretty small part of the consumer market.
Priyanka, I have a question for you about those. What was the charging infrastructure like in Mexico?
Yeah, it was kind of similar to if anyone's ridden in a Tesla, you know that the car sort of programs you to go to the nearest charging station. So a lot of the software in those cars was very similar. They had an app that basically sort of indicated the closest charging station. And the thing about the infrastructure is that, you know, I was in Mexico City, folks are doing city driving, right? So it wasn't necessarily that they were looking for, 300, 400 miles that they needed to travel before charging. They could kind of do these like short little spurts, right? Where they drive 50 miles, charge a little bit, drive 50 miles, charge a little bit. So it was just a really interesting, different type of model also of these more urban chargers that people used for shorter periods of time.
Yeah, that's interesting. You see those in a bunch of places where they're just part of like the parking meter infrastructure, basically. And it's just interesting to think about as charging gets faster, what are those options? Also, just like, highway, we've had such a hard time in the US getting charging into highway rest stops for some reason, and just the ongoing challenges here of charging. But it's super interesting to look at other places. Speaking of which, Nuin-Tara, I think you also have been a world traveler lately. So tell us what you're seeing out there in the world, stuff related to this podcast.
Yeah, I was just in Finland last week. Took a week off. Made the long trek out to Finland.
Yeah, it took you like a million hours.
A million hours each way. It was our friends over there founded an amazing organization called Snow Change. They do amazing work around land restoration, watershed resilience, plus real deep connections and ties into cultural landscape and cultural practices throughout the Arctic. So this one has both a personal hook, but the story underneath is bigger than just my summer vacation. The United Nations Environment Program put out its State of Finance for Nature 2026 report earlier this year, so not an immediate headline from this week, but the headline in that report was stark. For every dollar that the world invests in protecting or restoring nature, $30 are spent on activities that degrade it. And only about $220 billion went to nature-based solutions in 2023. But we need about 2.5 times that, or about $557 billion a year by 2030, just to hit existing climate and biodiversity targets. So one of the things that I think is a continuing question that, shows up in headlines all the time and in the policy space that I think we're all in is part of the challenge in this funding gap that was highlighted in that report is because the majority of funding comes from concessional capital. That's capital that's, while critically important through public and philanthropic grants, are just not enough to fill the gap and the need to get to these targets. So bringing it back to my trip last week, Snow Change is basically a 25-year proof of concept for an alternative approach. While they've leveraged philanthropic and public grants, they've also built in local business models that support and sustain traditional fishing practices. So bringing all of this back to our podcast is really this question, which is how do we get past treating resilience as a philanthropic add-on and start building an economy where investing in healthy, resilient systems, whether that's natural systems, communities, in our, building a more resilient economy, is just how business gets done.
Yeah, I think those are... Oh, no, I was just going to say, I think those are exactly the right questions, Nuin-Tara, and the ones we need to answer in order to kind of, as you said, get all this work to scale. And it reminds me of a book that I read many years ago that really helped change my thinking after being indoctrinated in economics as an undergraduate and graduate school. But I picked it up again recently because my older son actually just read it. And it's Donut Economics by Kate Raworth. Okay. I don't know if any of you have checked it out. But yeah, she argues, which I just love this phrase, that we can create economies that are distributive and regenerative by design. And I think that's just kind of another phrasing of exactly those questions you're asking about how we create economic systems that serve our goals and needs of this moment. And we know the economy is embedded in the environment, but it's also embedded in our political system and shaped by the policies and regulations that we put in place. And to your point at the top with that really sad, I guess, number about kind of the dollars going into environmentally friendly things and destructive ones, we can shift that and put more dollars into nature positive activities if we change the way the system's working. And I just love this quote. I'll just throw out another quote for you guys today from David Graeber, who's that famous anthropologist. And he wrote, "The hidden truth of the world is that it's something we make and we could just as easily make differently." And so I'm really excited to talk about how we make that economic system differently to support these resilience and climate goals.
I have to admit, I never understood the donut metaphor. Can you just, and I've heard about this and talked about it so many times, and I don't understand the donut. Can you just explain the donut?
Yeah. So this is my understanding of, obviously, her concept, which is that we want to live in the donut, which means we don't want to fall into the hole, because in the hole is where people aren't getting enough resources to meet their needs. So that's like, deep poverty. We don't want anyone having to be there or not getting all of their needs met, whether that's economic or social or cultural. But then we also don't want to exceed the carrying capacity of the Earth's finite resources. And so that's staying within the donut. So we want to give everyone a good life without destroying our natural resources.
Got it. I love that there's a donut over there, and then there's Ezra Klein's Everything Bagel. So between the bagel and the donut, it's like many round things with holes.
All these hungry authors or something.
Oh, I know. Well, you can it depends on where you live, whether you're a donut or a bagel person. I want to jump into our main topic soon, but any other thoughts on all this? There's a lot to dig into because we'll basically be going into all of these things in huge amount of detail. But Priyanka, I know you had a book that you've been thinking about lately too.
I mean, this whole idea really makes me wonder, how do we engage people into the politics of this vision of the future? I've been on a nonfiction break. I need to dive into fiction, and I need to sort of take a break from facts and figures. And I read last week this book called Once There Were Wolves by Charlotte McConaughey. She does amazing cli-fi or climate fiction. And she just described this concept and these tensions that you guys are talking about, So in the book, scientists are trying to rewild the Scottish Highlands with wolves who were hunted to extinction, but really critical to cull the overpopulated deer, and, the deer overgraze the landscape. They prevent the native forest from regenerating. And the scientists are trying to explain to the community, a really rural community, like, this is good for biodiversity. This is good for the ecosystem. This is good for natural carbon capture, And of course, all the farmers are primarily concerned first and foremost with protecting their livestock because they think the wolves are going to attack their livestock. It's the key to their livelihoods in this rural place. And it's kind of the fundamental tension of the book, right? Of course, there's some romance and like a little murder mystery also, but it's really making me wonder, like, how do we build new opportunities into these investments? And, through the opportunity, can we build political will?
Yep.
So I'm curious what you guys think.
Yeah, I love that. I just reviewed a climate fiction book about Scotland. Scotland seems to be a kind of a generative place for these. I think because people live very close to nature, and so there's a real relationship there, and also a history. That tension, right? I mean, these are deep tensions that we're talking about, right? Like, we're talking about industrial policy, which, like, by definition is industrial, and that's a deep tension with this question of sort of how do we do stewardship of our natural resources? How do we think about resource constraints? How do we think about the real impacts of climate on building out those industries? I mean, it's very, very complicated and interactive. And so I love that we're doing both the podcasts. We may need to periodically come back together to talk about the intersection because it's super important. But I'm going to move us into a little bit of a main segment since we got a lot to talk about already today. But I did want to say, just in terms of things that are really top of mind in California, the state budget was just passed by the legislature. California's budget process is fascinating. But basically, as folks probably know, the legislature has to pass some kind of budget by June 15th every year, because if they don't get paid. So they always do it. It's been a great incentive. I think they've never been late signing it since that rule was passed because they like getting paid. But just because they signed it doesn't mean it's done. There's a huge more that goes into the budget process after this. This is sort of in some ways, it's like yet another opening salvo from the legislature. And then you go into this whole budget negotiation with the governor's office again. And I think the budget has really, in every conversation I've been in about it with anyone in Sacramento, everyone has sort of started with, we don't have any money, right? Like, oh, fiscal constraints, this thing we want to do through the legislature, the fiscal is, as people say, the fiscal is too high and it's too expensive. We're not going to be able to do it. But at the same time, we just at the California Stewardship Network, which is our great partner at California Forward of folks around the state working at the regional level and really seeing stuff play out on the ground. We just got a great Department of Finance briefing over there. And finance was telling us, look, like, we have a bunch more revenue coming in because the state is so dependent on personal taxes and capital gains and the stock market. So things like the SpaceX IPO are a very big deal for California's budget. But we also have all these more expenses like the LA fires, which I know you, Carolyn and Nuin-Tara, spend a lot of time thinking about. So how are we thinking about this budget? I mean, we have these critical needs, this incredibly volatile budget. And what are you guys thinking about going into this budget session? It seems like just incredibly, there's a lot, right? There's a lot of uncertainty. There's a lot of priority. How are we thinking about it? What are you guys tracking?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that we've been thinking a lot about here related to this is the state's rainy day fund, which is officially called the Budget Stabilization Account, which exists because our revenues, as you mentioned, Kate, in California is so volatile. And in some ways it's, volatile by design. So the rainy day fund was created, and I'll just give a shout out because California Forward was the principal architect of the fund back a number of years ago to help manage and deal with this volatility in the budget. And so I think one of the things this year that we're focused on is, how do we get out of the year over year food fight about this approach of trying to, apportion limited scarce budget and resources to a different conversation, which is how do we have more stability in our underlying budget so that when we have these dips or, these spikes where we've got, decreased revenue coming in, followed by record revenue years, that we're not in this whiplash budget situation, which is hard for everyone. It's hard for the state. It's hard for state grant programs to manage programs when you don't have certainty. You have to staff up, staff down. You've got to do all of these things to try to figure out how to do it. And it's really hard for communities who are dependent on the funds as well, because you can't plan around it in a consistent way. I think this year is a good example of that whiplash. In January, the governor's proposed budget had a $2.9 billion shortfall. The May revise came out and said the deficit was eliminated through 2028. And then the budget the legislature just passed last year had bet on even higher revenue, mostly, as Kate, you mentioned, coming out of AI stock gains to add about $2 billion more. So that's just in one short set of months here, in one cycle in 1 year. We've seen this year over year. So I think the piece and the tension that, we all really need to be thinking about here is, how do we actually get a more stable approach in the state budget? How do we have more stable, dependable revenues that we can be, allocating? And then ideally also, both allocating for direct, immediate social services, which are so critical, but also importantly for the long-term risk and resilience work, to actually sustained investment in the long-term risk reduction that is critically important to not getting so far behind these disasters that are impacting every part of our state. And we'll get to a place where we just are overrun by those costs. So this question of budget stabilization, I think, is really a prerequisite to how we think about long-term resilience across the state.
100%. So much there. Carolyn, I just because Nuin-Tara brought up a bunch of things I know you're thinking about a lot. I'm curious what you're seeing specifically in the budget. I know you've thought a lot about the rainy day fund and sort of this stability question. What are you seeing in terms of sort of how that's playing out, how that kind of volatility is actually playing out this year in the budget?
Yeah, maybe kind of two thoughts. One, actually coming back, Kate, to something you said at the top about how in these budgetary constrained environments, you hear this, we can't afford it, it's too expensive. And I think just in California, but also in many other places, private and public, we lose track of what the costs are of not doing things, and to kind of come to what Nuin-Tara was talking about in terms of, sustained commitments to do the loss reduction and resilience work. If we don't fund those things and find ways to get that work done, the costs are just going to be higher in the future. And I think a big challenge with budgeting, again, in both the public and the private sector, is that often those disaster costs and liabilities aren't tracked. They're not on our budget. So when we don't see those costs in the future, our investments in lowering risks today look just like expenditures without that corresponding benefit, which is really sort of a troubling accounting situation, right? To make sure that we're actually accounting for the benefits of those investments. So I know a lot of the conversations recently in the state around the rainy day fund are more about the volatility of the revenues, as you both talked about. But as Nuin-Tara was flagging, there's also this concern about increasing budget volatility related to climate risks growing in the future as well, that also need to be accounted for.
And it's not something that the Department of Finance is consistently putting into its projections either, which is interesting, right? So even though we know, right, that climate impacts are not predictable in terms of exactly when things happen, but it's certainly predictable that more things will happen and they'll be more frequent and severe, that isn't being incorporated consistently into budgeting, which feels very kind of existential, right? I mean, just as the AI bubble question is kind of existential on the revenue side for us, I think the climate impact thing is kind of existential on the spending side. As is, Priyanka, to something you and I've talked about a lot. Look, we're just going to spend more. We are spending more and more on the safety net in California as well. We have all this data showing we're creating really high income jobs. We're creating really low income jobs. We're not creating a ton of jobs that create real careers for people. And so fundamentally, that means more people are going on to publicly funded programs for their safety net. And that's also a huge side on the spending side.
Yeah, I mean, I think my big concern with this budget and just sort of our fiscal health moving forward And it's a bigger point that I think we need to talk about more, which is that when people are taken care of, it's actually good for like the fiscal and economic health of a place. But the cuts from OBBA last year are going to translate, for California in particular, those cuts to Medi-Cal are going to be pretty severe because a lot of that funding does rely on federal funding. And, I saw stats saying that maybe up to 2 million Californians could lose their health care. And this is an ongoing conversation that's being had around the budget, which is, okay, what stopgap measures can the state put forward to ensure that folks don't get kicked off their health care? But also the scale and the size of this is such that there are going to be austerity changes that happen to Medi-Cal and also to CalFresh and all of these other programs that millions of Californians rely on, And I think about that a lot because it's an unbelievably cruel thing that's happening.
Absolutely. One, just as a anecdote here, I mean, we were in a conversation with some legislative staff a couple months ago, and, we're making case around why we need sustained investment in wildfire risk reduction and resilience and all of the points we've been talking about here today. And, very candidly, the person we were talking to said the lens that we are using this year is this investment a higher priority than somebody losing their health care? That's what we have to make our decisions this year, which, again, like we need to think about beyond the scarcity approach and think about additional, how do we grow the pie? But that's a real reality that, legislators and policymakers are having to make decisions around right now.
Well, and it's just also such a different conversation than in many other countries, in that in the US, our healthcare is so tied to employment. So this question around what kind of economy we build, what kind of jobs are available, will there still be as many jobs given AI? I mean, all these questions that are swirling are inextricably related to people's healthcare, people's ability to afford things, right? It's so challenging because the affordability conversation gets very short term around what's the cost of the thing in the bill this month and whether somebody has healthcare this month. And the reality is this is all system related, right? I mean, these are all, is there a job that provides that healthcare? Do you have the ability to pay for that thing? I mean, those two sides of that coin are incredibly important, but also politics make it hard to talk about the long term always, right?
Well, I think it's really interesting. I don't know if folks saw, just bringing up Mexico every episode.
Well, you were just there, so
President Sheinbaum just announced a couple months ago that they're in the process of doing sweeping health reforms. They're aiming to achieve universal health coverage for every Mexican citizen by 2027. And so we are now straddled by two systems that do provide sort of more comprehensive public and affordable healthcare options to their citizens. And of course, none of these programs are perfect. None of these plans are perfect. But it makes me also, as we're talking about climate resilience, invoking these questions of what does it mean to build resilience into our social safety nets, into our social service systems, because that is also going to be climate resilience in the face of, disasters that happen on a dime or heat waves or what have you.
100%. Well, and just on that point, one of the cuts in the budget in California right now is this cut specifically to school, air conditioning and HVAC systems and efficiency measures, which is exactly on point, right? It's like, we don't have enough money to pay for these things that would actually serve to save a bunch of money in terms of health costs and extreme heat related costs and resilience costs down the road. But it's like this immediate question versus these longer term impacts, which is just continues to be such a challenge. And I think one thing we should be talking about on future shows is should we be budgeting differently? How do we actually think about this in operation? Because it's incredibly hard to make these decisions right now with the structure that we have. So so much to say on all of that. I am tasked though on keeping us moving. But before we wrap up, to get back to the fun part, I want to play a quick round of By the Numbers. This is a trivia game where we have to guess the number from a real California story. Could be a recent report or a study on something. So we bring a number, someone brings a number, everyone else guesses what it is, and the one closest to the number wins. Carolyn, handing it to you for our By the Numbers trivia question today.
Thanks, Kate. And right off the bat, I'm going to ask for a slight modification because I'm going to make you guess two numbers, but you'll see why, because seeing them in comparison is the
You
interesting
insurance
thing.
people, you're always changing the goalpost.
And it's an insurance question, of course, from some recent work we've been doing. So listeners are well aware, right? When you can't find coverage in the private insurance market, your alternative is to go to the FAIR plan, which is the kind of market of last resort. And we've been seeing some growth in that market, to say the least, recently. So I want you to give me two numbers. The first is, what is the average percentage of policyholders in low-risk zip codes in the state that have to use the FAIR plan? And what is the percentage of residents in the highest risk zip codes that have to find coverage in the FAIR plan on average? Low risk, high risk. Who wants to go first?
I can go first. And I feel like if I get these wrong, it's going to be bad because I know these numbers.
You should know.
I've been working with you on these numbers.
As the host of this podcast, you have to.
But okay, I'm hope to be in the right ballpark here, but I'm gonna guess low risk across the state is like 5 to 6%. And then high risk is, I think it's close to 50%. Those are my guesses.
Okay, Priyanka, what do you think?
I was also going to guess around 50% for high risk areas. And then low risk areas, I was going to guess like close to 1%, maybe 0%.
Yeah, I'm going to go higher in the high risk areas. I just feel like everyone I know is on the FAIR plan, basically. So I'm going to say like 60% in the high risk areas and like less than 1% in the low risk areas. Carolyn, what is the actual answer?
Okay, the actual answer for low risk areas is 3% and high risk areas is 41%. That's on average. So there are zip codes that are much higher. And Nuin-Tara, your numbers were exactly right for the state average.
Oh,
so that was
phew.
Oh, good.
Then I can keep hosting the podcast.
Which is about
Great.
6%. Yeah, because interestingly, and I know we're moving along, one last fun fact here is that when you just look at the number of structures, though, the number of structures in that highest quintile of risk is pretty small. It's like 5% of structures, right? But they're responsible for 65% of insured losses. So we have this really concentrated fire risk problem that is driving and intimately related to our insurance issues. So excited for Nuin-Tara and I to dig in more on that topic later.
Well, and I would love to see the next level of this, which is like of those areas are the high risk areas also higher value homes that are being covered. And what does that look like? Like what percentage of value of homes? And Priyanka, I know that you have one of these, although I'm going to save it for our show because I am running out of time here. So congratulations to Nuin-Tara.
Thanks for saving.
For winning that. But as we wrap up, Priyanka, talk about what you and I are going to be digging into on our first podcast later this month.
Yeah. So stay tuned, everyone. We're going to be talking about a topic that is extremely hot right now, which is transmission. And so basically, transmission.
Only we would think that was an extremely hot topic, but yes.
Well, people are going to learn how hot this topic is because we have an extremely old grid system and we need to upgrade our transmission in order to essentially move our economy forward, move our energy transition forward. And I'm really excited. We are speaking with Assemblywoman Petrie Norris. She has an incredibly interesting bill in the legislature right now that is thinking about transmission, about manufacturing. And we're hoping to sort of dig in with her about what it would look like to make these pieces of this critically important supply chain that has tons of backups right now in terms of getting these component pieces out, making it right here in California. What would that mean for jobs? What would that mean for energy costs? What would that mean for affordability? And, moving forward, that's kind of what we're going to be digging into. What are the politics of this stuff? How do we sort of use policy tools in a way that can connect people to this transition? And how can California be a manufacturing powerhouse once again?
Love that. And for those who are tracking, you know that Assemblymember Petrie Norris is increasingly playing a really important role on kind of all things related to energy and utilities. And so we're super excited that she wants to come and talk to us, and we'll be grilling her on the podcast. So get ready for that. Nuin-Tara and Carolyn, what is up next for you all?
Yeah, Carolyn and I kick off in mid-July, so excited for this first episode. We're going to actually be doing a series of quick hit interviews with members of our adaptation finance work group. So shout out to everybody who's on that work group, an amazing group of national experts and some California-based folks as well around adaptation finance. And as we're kind of treating this first episode as really foundational conversation to get at some of the core questions that we'll be digging into throughout the series. For example, what is adaptation finance? What are economic and fiscal impacts of climate change? So after that, we've got a strong list lined up of conversations we're going to be having. Carolyn, what are some of the topics you're most excited to cover?
Yeah, we're going to be doing a deeper dive at some creative resilience funding models that are working in other states and thinking about what they mean for California. We're going to have an episode that asks whether our climate future is even insurable, with some guests who've been thinking hard about that. We're going to look at the climate risks that nobody's managing and nobody's pricing yet. And then we'll do a post-legislative session breakdown of the year's wildfire and insurance bills once the session wraps. So the through line through all of this is, how do we pay for resilience, and can our financial system, insurance reserves, all of it keep up with our changing risks?
Awesome. Well, very excited about the shows coming up and really happy to be doing this with all of you. As I mentioned, the goal for the California Dreamshot is to share in-depth, informed, authentic, sometimes hard discussions around topics like the economy and resilience for those who are actually out there trying to move stuff forward in California. So we think it's going to be a lot of fun. Our listeners out there, we'd love to hear from you. If you have topics, you have issue areas, you have guests, you want to be a guest, reach out to us. You can hit us up on LinkedIn. We're all on LinkedIn, as is California Forward, or at California Forward's website, which is cafwd.org. Thanks so much, Nuin-Tara, Priyanka, Carolyn. I'm very excited to go on this adventure with you all. With that, we're out.
Likewise.
Thank you.
California Dreamshot is a production of California Forward, produced in partnership with Pretty Good Productions. Our executive producer is Thomas Clayton Miller, and our associate producer is Sarah Walsh. Thanks, everyone, for listening. See you next time.